Hello. Today we'd like to look at imaginary numbers. I guess today will be the first part of imaginary numbers, and we'll continue with further operations on the imaginary numbers or complex numbers. Now, as you do now, what I'd like to do is I want you to look at these two questions: x squared equals 1, and the other one is x squared equals -1. And I want you to find the value or values of x if possible. All right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time for you to look through them. That's right. So for the first one, x squared equals 1. What's the value of x? That's right. For those of you who was thinking about 1, will be correct answer. Is there anything else? Yes, that's right. -1 also works. So in fact, another way of writing it is plus or minus 1. How about that? X can be plus 1, positive 1, or x can be -1, minus 1. Now, then the second question will be x squared equals -1. Which number, when it's multiplied by itself, will get you -1? Now, yes, it's quite difficult to think about that number, isn't it? Because if you have to think about -1, but when you multiply -1 times -1, will be +1, just like you have seen it over here. So then let's think about this one for a second. How do you get rid of the square so that we can get x? Yes, one simple way for you to do this, when you take the square root of both sides, then what's going to be happening is x can be equal to x can be equal to 1 or x can be equal to -1 because square root and then square cancels out in one way. But to be more technical, this will be in fact equal to absolute value of x. Those of you who are familiar with absolute value, this will be the algebraic definition of it. But at this point, we're just going to assume that that is equal to x. Now, how about the second one? When you take the square root of both sides, then yes, on the left side we'll get x, and then we will get positive or negative, because when we have negative number, when you multiply that by itself, it will become positive. But on the right side, we have square root of -1. Now, you see, when we are thinking about square root of -1, you might wonder, how is it possible? Which number can you multiply by itself will get -1? In fact, in the real world, it's not going to be possible. Or should I say, in the real numbers, there is no such number that will get you that value. So when the mathematicians were thinking about it, try to communicate this idea of square root of negative number, they have to come up with another way to express that. And we call that imaginary. Because you could only imagine, simply put, you could only imagine that could happen. Because it's very difficult concept for you to think about in a real world. So we call that this is imaginary number. And being mathematicians, what people have done was they decided to use I to represent that. So in fact, let me just erase this one. I equals square root of -1. Now, then knowing this concept, let's try to tackle a couple more questions here. Okay. So, I want you to evaluate number 1, square root of -4. Now, number 2 will be square root of 4. Now, actually, why don't you do number 2 first? Square root of 4. What will that be equal to? Yes, that's right. This value will be equal to 2, simply. But how about square root of -4? In fact, one way for us to describe -4 will be this. Square root of -1 times square root of 4. Then here, what is square root of -1? That's equal to I. Multiply that by square root of 4 becomes 2. That's right. So in fact, the answer becomes I times 2, or we can call that as 2I. Now, then one difference between square root of 4 becomes square root of -4 was 2 versus 2I. Alright, then let me get to one more question and see what happens. Number 3. How about what if I were to give you square root of negative 9? And number 4 was square root of negative 12. How would you evaluate both of them or simplify both of them? Alright, so that's right. Number 3, in fact, you can separate this one into square root of negative 1 times square root of 9. Now, square root of negative 1 becomes I, times square root of 9 becomes 3. Hence, you end up getting 3i. How about square root of negative 12? Now, in this case, you can first separate that into square root of negative 1 and square root of 12. But you know that square root of 12 can be further separated into square root of negative 1 and then square root of 4 times square root of 3. Then here it goes. Square root of negative 1 becomes I. Square root of 4 becomes 2. And square root of 3 cannot be simplified any further, so therefore it will be simply radical 3. Now, here we can write it as I 2 radical 3, or we can say 2i radical 3. Now, by now, I'm thinking, what kind of things have you observed? That's right. Whenever you see negative numbers, seemingly negative numbers, whenever you see the negative sign within the square root, you end up having I. While when you didn't have the negative sign, then you would have just evaluated or simplified as it was appeared. Now, then how about this one? Number 5 and number 6. So number 5 was square root of negative 8. I'll just simplify this one. And number 6 would have been cube root of negative 8. Why don't you try to tackle these two questions? That's right. So let's look at number 5 first. Those of you who worked on this one, yes, first this can be separated into square root of negative 1 times square root of 8. Now, but this one can be further broken down into square root of negative 1, and 8 is in fact equal to 2 squared times 2. So therefore here, this one becomes I, and square root of, 2 squared comes out of the radical, becomes 2, and square root of 2. So our final answer becomes 2i square root of 2. How about number 6? So in one way, number 5 was very similar to number 4, but number 6 is a little bit different. I have given you cube root of negative 8. Are you thinking about I now? In fact, the answer doesn't involve I, because if you think about this one carefully, the answer would have been negative 2. Yes, the answer is negative 2. Because here, you have to realize that I'm looking for a number. Cube root basically means I'm looking for a number when it's multiplied by itself 3 times. It's supposed to give us negative 8. Which number will that be? That's right, negative 2. Because in other words, this can be rewritten as negative 2 to the third power. You see, when you multiply negative 2 to the negative 2 by itself 3 times, then you would have gotten negative 8. So cube root and cube cancels out, get you negative 2 as the answer. How about that? Not bad, right? Now, so that's basically how we can evaluate, simplify imaginary numbers. Alright, on the next video we'll talk about powers of I and other operations. Alright, thank you. Have a nice day. See you later.